Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Rensselaer Global Game Changers online panel discussion, The Influence of Biotechnology in a Changing World, presented by the Rensselaer Greater New York Executive Council. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please make sure your volume is turned all the way up. You will be muted throughout the presentation out of respect to our presenters. You will see that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions throughout the program. We also received some questions during the registration process, and we will get to them as time allows during the Q&A portion of the program. I am now pleased to introduce our host and moderator for today's discussion. Dr. Jonathan Dortick is Vice Chair of the Rensselaer Greater New York Executive Council, Special Advisor to the President for Strategic Initiatives, and Howard P. Eiserman Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Welcome, Dr. Dortick.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. More than 200 of you are actually participating in this panel, so we're quite excited to bring this to you. Let me first take a moment to recognize Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, Rensselaer President, who is joining us today. I also want to acknowledge several members of the Rensselaer Board of Trustees who are joining us. These include Dr. John Bennett of the class of 1974, and co-chair of the newly established Rensselaer Capital Region Executive Council, Arthur Golden of the class of 1966 and chairman of the Board of Trustees, Curtis Preem of the class of 1982, secretary of the Board of Trustees, parent of Gabriel, a member of the class of 2022, and of course namesake of the Curtis R. Preem Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, or MPAC, David Hirsch of the class of 1965, Jeffrey Kodosky of the class of 1970, and also co-chair of the Texas Triangle Executive Council, Kate Murtaugh of the class of 1987, and also the chair of the New England Executive Council, and Paula Simon of the class of 1968. I'm also pleased to recognize the following members of the Rensselaer Greater New York Executive Council who join us today: Carl DeStephanis of the class of 1976, and Michael Richter of the class of 1968. So the Rensselaer Global Game Changers panel online series serves as thought leadership discussions that feature topics of emerging global importance with alumni and alumnae innovators in business, intellectual discovery, and entrepreneurship. Each panel is presented by regional executive councils in key geographic regions where there are engaged alumni, alumnae, and parents. These regional executive councils have been created to strengthen the alumni, alumnae, and parent network and offer opportunities for engagement. Today's conversation is presented by the Rensselaer Greater New York Executive Council, where we have nearly 40,000 alumni and alumnae, as well as parents, call home. Today's discussion is on the influence of biotechnology in a changing world. And as you can imagine, this topic cannot be any timelier. We will hear shortly from our expert panelists with a diverse array of backgrounds and experiences covering the research, innovation, and commercialization aspects of biotechnology. First, though, I would like to take just a few minutes to discuss biotechnology here at Rensselaer, although quite frankly, it's impossible to do true justice to this entire topic in such a short time. So Rensselaer has invested over $150 million in biotechnology. Quite frankly, it's probably even low to what's been invested. And that's a result of Dr. Jackson's leadership and steadfast commitment to this field since her arrival more than 20 years ago. This includes about $100 million to construct and equip the Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies, or CBIS, which was completed in 2004, as well as the extensive hiring of faculty, both senior and Constellation faculty, as well as junior faculty. The return on investment continues to grow with over $25 million in research funding per year within CBIS alone. This number is increasing. And importantly, new intellectual property that is being licensed to pharma and biotech, as well as to the start of new ventures. In the past several years, biotechnology at Rensselaer has made quite significant strides in the mechanisms of diseases, developing new therapeutics and medical devices, understanding the natural environment, and advancing the broad area of synthetic biology. These are areas that have already made a direct impact to COVID-19. Finally, Rensselaer has established several partnerships with major medical centers here in Albany and in New York City. For example, we've established a partnership with the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and have initiated the Institute for Engineering and Precision Medicine, or the IEPM. Over the next few months, you will hear much more about this new institute, which is actually located in New York City at the Mount Sinai Medical Center campus on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So we're living in unprecedented times. Less than a year ago, virtually no one outside of a few virologists and epidemiologists had heard of the emergence of a new coronavirus. Within days of identifying this new virus, researchers in China and elsewhere had sequenced the viral genome. And literally within days of that, the race to develop a vaccine was off and running. From hundreds of candidates, nearly 60 entered clinical trials worldwide, and a vaccine jointly from Pfizer and BioNTech has been given emergency authorization in several countries, leading to the first vaccinations here in the US just yesterday. The Moderna vaccine may be given emergency use authorization as soon as later this week. And vaccines from AstraZeneca and Oxford, as well as Johnson & Johnson, are expected to be complete early in the new year. This is an unprecedented speed with what appears to be exceptional efficacy and safety. Today, we will discuss the role of biotech and pharma and how we were in a position to advance vaccines so quickly, what we now face with one of the most complex logistic issues of our time in distributing the vaccine, and what other types of therapeutics are needed. Also, what are we doing and what more can be done to prepare for the inevitable next pandemic? And with a tremendous group of panelists that are here today, who knows where the discussion will lead, but I promise it will be interesting. So speaking of our panelists, let me welcome them with a brief set of introductions. So I would first like to introduce Dr. Claire Fraser, class of 1977, a recipient of the 2002 Rensselaer honorary degree, and it was my pleasure to actually host Claire while she had come here for the honorary degree. A 2011 Rensselaer Alumni Hall of Fame inductee, a 2008 RAA Alumni Key Award recipient, and former trustee here at Rensselaer. Dr. Fraser is director for the Institute for Genome Sciences and the Dean's Endowed Professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. Fraser currently serves as the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and helped launch the new field of microbial genomics that revolutionized the way microbiology is studied. Claire's current research interests are focused on the role of the human gut microbiome in health and disease. She has authored more than 320 publications, edited 3 books, served on the editorial boards of 9 scientific journals, received numerous awards, and for years was the most highly cited investigator in the field of microbiology. So welcome, Claire. Next, Mr. Mark Hernan, of the class of 1985 and a graduate of 1987. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Biogen. Mr. Hernan formerly served as Chief Information Officer and Vice President of Operations at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, a pioneering Cambridge-based biotech company, and Regional Chief Information Officer for the Americas with global responsibility for information technology and R&D at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, Japan's largest pharmaceutical company. Prior to his career in biopharma, Mark spent 14 years in management consulting. Well, welcome, Mark. And last but not least, Dr. Jesse True, of the class of 1968 and a 2008 RAA Alumni Key Award recipient, is a partner emeritus at Domain Associates, LLC. He has been a director of 38 early-stage healthcare companies, 23 of which have become successful public companies, and has served as a founder, president, and chairman of numerous venture-stage companies. Dr. True currently serves on the board of Aldera Pharmaceuticals and the board of trustees of Penn Medicine Princeton Health. 2016, Jesse co-founded the Stellar Energy Foundation, which is working to bring fusion energy to the electric grid soon enough to make a positive difference in the fight against climate change. He is a member of the Investment Advisory Board of the Harrington Discovery Institute, member of the Investment Committee of the American Physical Society, and a member of the RPI Science Leadership Council. So again, welcome to Dr. Fraser, Mr. Hernan, and Dr. True. So let's start with a few questions on a topic that's clearly on everyone's mind right now, the pandemic, and in particular, the vaccine, but also how COVID-19 really has impacted not just society, but biotechnology itself and pharma. So as I mentioned, Claire, this is for you. Just this week, vaccinations with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine have started here in the US. The speed at which this vaccine and those of Moderna and Oxford and AstraZeneca have truly been remarkable. So Claire, can you say a few words about how vaccine development has changed substantially from its earliest days, starting with a pathogen decades ago that would take 15 to 20 years to simply develop the vaccine, to genomics-enabled vaccine development, such as Bexsero, a meningococcal vaccine, that only took 4 to 5 years of development, to what is now the plug-and-play mRNA approach, which has led to shots in the arm well less than 1 year of development.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm happy to take this question. I think it's probably important to put vaccination in context and make it clear that this idea that you could use vaccination to prevent infection has a very long history. It goes all the way back to the late 1700s and the work of Edward Jenner, who observed that milkmaids who were in frequent contact with cows infected with cowpox were resistant to infection with smallpox. And his observation turned into practice that became very widespread very quickly, using cowpox to protect against smallpox. And it's probably worth noting that about 200 years after his observation in 1980, through enormous global vaccination efforts, smallpox was deemed to be officially eradicated. So that was important, and I think that really speaks to the power of vaccines. 100 years after Jenner, Louis Pasteur had an important observation, and that was that you really couldn't use fully virulent pathogens to immunize. You ended up killing your host. And so out of Pasteur's important work on rabies and anthrax, the notion of using attenuated or killed organisms for vaccination developed. I'd say probably the last part of the 20th century was really a very active time for vaccine R&D. New methods for growing viruses and bacteria in the lab led to new innovations. And I think many of us probably remember standing in line as children to receive new vaccines for polio, but other common childhood diseases were targeted for immunization at this time: measles, mumps, rubella, and those efforts had enormous positive public health implications. But throughout that rich 200-year history of vaccination, I think it's really important to stress that what was absolutely required as a first step was growing large amounts of the infectious agent as a prerequisite to doing any immunization. And that was both time consuming and very labor intensive. And I think it would be almost impossible to think about doing that now, as we find ourselves in the middle of what we anticipate will be another worldwide vaccination effort. The last 2 decades or so have seen a lot of additional innovation using, as you said, genomics and recombinant DNA technology to take a new approach to vaccine development. As you mentioned, I was involved in a collaboration with colleagues at Novartis Vaccines. We didn't start with the infectious agent. We started with the genome sequence. And in a matter of about 4 years, went from concept to product. And that was a huge step forward, because previously, with both the R&D efforts and regulatory approvals that were required, it wouldn't be unusual for it to take 15 years or so for a new vaccine to get to market. And now, as you mentioned, we're seeing the spectacular successes with the development of the new vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 based on a brand new mRNA platform. But I think it's really important to make the point that these didn't just come out of nowhere. They really were the product of enormous effort in the biotech ecosystem.
Claire, it's Jesse. Claire, if I can build on what you said, first let me say that we, society, should have seen this coming. By happenstance, I ran into a book that was published in 2019. It's written by Daniel Brooks called The Stockholm Paradigm. And he makes the point that the world is really in for it in a bad way because there's this entity called EID, emerging infectious diseases, which are going to accelerate in their virulence and danger to humanity because of climate change.
Absolutely.
We're moving the boundaries within which the parasites have been living because of temperature change. And that opens up new opportunities for these parasites to find new hosts. So it's amazing that this book really called COVID-19 a year before it hit. Mm-hmm. But to build on what you said about biotech's role in coming up with a vaccine in less than a year, the path that biotech as a technology is traversing is parallel in some ways to the path that semiconductors took, starting, 70 plus years ago, when a semiconductor made it possible to build a transistor, which was a one-for-one substitute for a vacuum tube. And in the early days of biotech, Genentech made its way forward by making a one-for-one substitute, making human recombinant insulin instead of farming it from natural sources. And then bifunctional monoclonal antibodies were the equivalent of putting two transistors on one chip. So now you had two functions in one molecule. Wow, whoopee-doo. And today, we're in the systems era. The mRNA vaccine technology is nothing short of a biological machine that replicates multiple functions as a system so that you can duplicate the power of nature to crank out more antigen into the body.
Well, thanks, Jesse. That actually was going to be my next question, so you made it easy for me. So let me transition a bit to more on the market side. And Mark, the development of a vaccine not only requires the genomic information we just heard about and whatever knowledge gains are critical in molecular immunology, but it requires commercial manufacturing, ultimately packaging and distribution. There are concerns arising every day now that center on the supply chain, not only in the actual manufacturing of the vaccine itself, which of course includes not only the actual biomanufacturing, but also the critical aspect of how you would distribute the vaccine. So given that you're in the middle of many aspects of commercial biopharma, what role do supply chains have in enabling efficient biomanufacturing? And if you were either Moderna or Pfizer, what would keep you up at night?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think with those two companies in particular, one of the biggest worries would obviously be extending the cold chain out to the regions and the sites that require the vaccine, right? These are very delicate molecules that require incredible care. And it poses all manner of logistical challenges for those two organizations. That goes hand in hand with some of the traditional supply chain risks we see in the industry around things like product diversion or product counterfeiting. So they have all the normal risks you would see in a supply chain environment. And of course, they're not in this alone, right? So when it comes to downstream distribution, these companies are working with government agencies and other organizations to get the vaccine to the sites where it'll be administered. And coordinating the logistics of that global distribution are tremendously complex. I guess two other things that are worth noting in this context. One is COVID itself. So manufacturing and supply chain management in biotech are highly automated, but we still rely on people to handle materials and physically handle the product. And if you were to have a COVID outbreak at a key manufacturing facility or at a key distribution site and the workforce was impacted, your ability to distribute the product is also affected. This is something we think about a lot in our business, even though it's not directly connected to COVID. We worry about outbreaks at our plants and our ability to supply our patients. And then the other thing I'd mention that's been featured widely in the news lately is cybersecurity. This poses a systemic risk to everything the industry is trying to do. And we've seen multiple reports of state-sponsored and other threat actors targeting companies like Moderna and Pfizer, but also targeting other stakeholders, academic institutions, regulators, et cetera. And they're not all direct attacks. So in some cases, these are indirect attacks, where the hackers compromise a software vendor or a service provider to establish an entry point from which they can launch their eventual attack on the true targets. And there's a great example of this being widely covered this week with the whole SolarWinds vulnerability that may have affected up to 18,000 organizations worldwide. So it's pretty daunting, and definitely plenty there to lose sleep over.
So let me follow up on this, but more from the standpoint of how the pandemic accelerated something that was already underway at biotech and pharma companies. So how did COVID accelerate innovation and digital transformation at the company? Let's say at Biogen, since you know so much more there, ranging from remote clinical trials, data capture, telemedicine, and so forth, as well as just simply how you work every day.
Yeah. Acceleration is a good word for it, John. So we've seen a number of challenges to the ways that we've currently done business, everything from restrictions to in-person interactions to hospitals prioritizing care of COVID patients over things like elective procedures and clinical trials. And even in the case where clinical trial subjects, who, remember, are typically ill to begin with, are reluctant to leave their homes, and especially reluctant to travel to a doctor's office or a hospital where they're going to run into other sick people. So the sort of industry operating model has sort of been turned on its head. And that's forced companies to ramp up activities and initiatives that have been puttering along for years, but have never really gained traction in the industry. So in our case, for example, at this point, 100% of our interactions with healthcare providers are remote. That's everything from a one-on-one meeting between a medical representative from Biogen and a healthcare professional to an advisory committee to a full-blown medical congress. They are all remote at this point. Slightly different story with respect to clinical trials and patient care. In those cases, the role of the biotech company is less direct. We don't have a lot of direct interaction with clinical trial subjects or with patients. So for the most part, what we're trying to do is adapt with the ecosystem. As providers move to more telemedicine, more remote care, we're trying to draft off that and figure out how to more effectively conduct clinical trials. But we are at the same time making investments in things like drug delivery systems that would allow patients or clinical trial subjects to self-administer a drug, whereas they would have typically had to travel to a clinic to get that drug administered. We're also looking at digital tools to screen potential clinical trial participants, to provide information and services to patients once they're on our drugs, et cetera. So the whole pandemic has really kickstarted a much more expanded and effective use of technology. And I don't think we're going back when this is over. I think the pendulum will swing back a little bit, but we're in a new normal at this point.
Let me stay on the commercialization side for a minute and go back to Jesse. You know, we've seen a lot of fairly large scale acquisitions as well as some IPOs in the biotech area, even during this period. But what about in the actual formation of new ventures during this period? Has that been impacted at all? Or have there been some rather new focus on what really would be a commercially viable entity?
When the COVID crisis hit, I figured, boy, the venture industry in particular and biotech is toast. And I can tell you that our portfolio has lost at least one company directly because it was trying to launch a product and the doctor's offices were all closed because of the nature of the product. It was an office that could close for a while. We lost the whole company. It was thinly capitalized in the first place. We've lost clinical trials because patients wouldn't show up. And, that's really expensive. You lose a year of burn for a company. That's a whole financing that you have to face up to. But it was like Never Land. The NASDAQ Biotech Index is up 24% this year. It's crazy. It's as crazy as the rest of the market. And the venture community is moving forward unabated. They're forming deals. They're doing diligence by virtual, by Zoom and WebEx, and you wouldn't know that there's a crisis out there. You really wouldn't. It's amazing.
Would that impact? Well, how would that impact, let's say, the actual new formation of a venture, which of course is going to primarily be driven from what comes out of a university like Rensselaer?
I think that after a little bit of nervousness, I think it's business almost as usual. It's incredible, but the tail end of that pipeline, there've been almost 40 IPOs in the fall alone. They're doing really well, and new venture funds are being raised, and the venture capital community is deploying money into new startups. It's a different process of socialization, right? Because when you start a company from scratch, you do a lot of hanging around with the entrepreneur. You just kind of hang out, shoot the breeze, explore who's going to do what the goals of the company are, who the first hires are going to be. And all of that is taking place virtually now. I wish I had a, what's the right word? There is no right word. A time machine. One of the things that's benefited from COVID-19 is telemedicine. And, always being a forward thinker.
Yeah, but you're a physicist. You should have been able to figure it out.
I invested in a telemedicine company in 1998. And the big challenge was, oh my gosh, how do we get doctors paid for a televisit in 1998? That thing crashed and burned. But today, telemedicine, it's cooking.
So let me just circle back now back to the science. And Claire, actually I have two questions. One is, there's been some anecdotal information out there that actually you could get relatively significant protection from old vaccines against viruses that are completely new, like SARS-CoV-2. Is that something that you feel has some merit?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, it's not without merit. And, anytime you immunize, you are kickstarting the general immune response. And there are certainly similarities in the immune response to one pathogen versus another. But it's not in any way going to be a panacea. And again, I think it's because we've come to understand that the immune response is exquisitely specific. So while you might get partway there with an old vaccine, you're not going to achieve the level of immune protection that you could with a specific vaccine. So it's an interesting idea. I think it was brought forward in part because, not so many months ago, we felt we were desperate for any possible solution, but I don't think it makes sense as a long-term strategy.
So along the lines of therapeutics, let's leave vaccines for a minute and just look more generally at actually treating diseases like viral infections. Why has it been so difficult to develop a broad-based antiviral?
Yeah, again, it's important. It's a good question. And just to make it clear that antivirals are different than antibiotics that target bacteria. And I think that the complexity of the viral universe, and it's really, probably only a couple of hundred viruses that are known currently to infect humans, but they represent enormous viral diversity. And these differences serve as real obstacles to the development of broad spectrum antiviral agents. differences in terms of whether these are RNA or DNA viruses, single or double-stranded viruses, different proteins that the virus uses to replicate itself, different proteins on human cell surfaces that the viruses use to invade cells. So it's been hard to find commonalities, and that has stymied the development of broad spectrum antiviral therapies. I think the other thing that has been somewhat problematic is that we know that viruses aren't alive, and they need to get into host cells to replicate and make additional copies. So that means that any antiviral drugs have to work inside human cells. So you need to get into the cells where the viruses are in order to block their function. And I think what we've seen is that there have been very large numbers of potential antiviral agents that work extraordinarily well in vitro, in the laboratory, in cell culture. But when they are moved into animal models or into humans, they are no longer viable candidates because of toxicity. So that's another problem. A lot of these issues we don't have with regard to antibiotic development against bacteria. But that said, there's just been extraordinary work on expanding the arsenal of antiviral drugs, and several different viral families are now covered in terms of therapeutics, but they tend to be fairly specific. And I'm not sure, based on what I know about viral mechanisms, that we should hold out hope for a breakthrough broad spectrum antiviral candidate.
Thanks. So I'd like to move to really what's going to happen now. Where are we going to go, both as from a scientific perspective as well as where are we going to go as society. So, and Jesse brought up the issue of climate change. Clearly that is having an impact on the development of new types of infectious disease, particularly zoonotic diseases, and how, being able, and coronavirus is a zoonotic disease, just like influenza. And so many of the viral diseases come in that way. But in a very broad sense, let's take a step back and say, okay, here's another case where mankind is hit by a tremendously dangerous infectious disease. So we ask this all the time, but we better start thinking about it better now. But what steps do we need to take right now to be better prepared for what will be another pandemic? Maybe another coronavirus, or maybe something like a more virulent H1N1 influenza. What do we need to do?
Well, the author Daniel Brooks wimps out. At the end of his book, you flip to the back and you hope that he's going to say, okay, here is the formula for, stopping the next pandemic. And he doesn't. He just wimps out. He says, the answer is, and this is, literally, it's so typical of the healthcare system. They make an acronym out of it. DAMA, document, assess, monitor, and act. But in fact, so he says the world has to be diligent in looking ahead, monitoring what pathogens are growing in number, document them, assess the threat, monitor the threat, and then be ready to act. So I think that's a wishy-washy answer. I've got a, you ready for a blue sky? I mean, this is, can I just give you blue sky, John?
Yeah, why not?
All right. So back to my analogy with the pathway of semiconductors. So when semiconductors hit the real systems level, for example, what's going on in semiconductors, which is a step away from information technology, something near and dear to RPI's home base. So what was one of the seminal transformations of systems semiconductor technology? It was the GPU, NVIDIA. Curtis, I don't know if you're on the phone on this Zoom call, but another tip of the hat for really changing the world with parallel processing computing. Biology is now in the age of big data. What did the GPU enable? You started, Curtis, focusing on the gaming industry, but now the NVIDIA chip is the enabling element of massive parallel processing for deep learning neural networks. And deep learning neural networks is a step or two away from being able to invent their own solutions to problems and think ahead with deep learning. So the analogy is that you take something like CRISPR-Cas9, which is so exquisitely powerful, and you can drop in one little element of RNA that makes it specific, and you can cut a DNA where you want. What if 15, 20 years from now, we have biological systems that are doing the biological equivalent of deep learning, artificial intelligence, and this little biological bot figures out what kind of drug is necessary, what elements of a biological network have to be impacted, and then goes about designing its own solution, just as in some vague way the immune system reacts to the threat and solves it. My blue sky prediction is 15, 20 years from now, biological systems are going to solve their own problems.
Yeah, I think in fact there are examples like that that are beginning to come about. And you hit on the immune system, of course, which is a natural approach to that. And we still know probably a fraction, very small fraction of actually how the immune system works. Let me bring up some numbers here that I think are shocking, and I want to get a sense from all of you about, whether this is something that's going to really push, us, the society in the U.S. to do something about. So actually, it was a opinion piece in the Journal of American Medical Association just a month or so ago by David Cutler and Larry Summers, and they indicated that the overall economic impact of this pandemic in the U.S. is going to be about $16 trillion, which in a given year, that represents 90% of our GDP. And that doesn't even count for, of course, the tragic loss of life and what could have potentially come about in terms of economics from people we lose. And so then contrast that with our funding today of the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease, which is $5.5 billion in today's dollars. That represents, believe it or not, 3 hours of GDP that's lost due to the pandemic. 3 hours. So it seems like the cost of providing this appropriate funding far outweighs the cost of another pandemic. So do you think there's a sufficient will of society as well as our government to address something like this and more significantly put in the funding that's required to really address these things?
Happy to take that. I would, in an ideal world, I'd like to think that the will exists, but I think so far we haven't seen that be the case. And I'm afraid that once COVID is in the rearview mirror, we will be playing our zero-sum game with whatever research budget we have and trying to figure out what the more immediate concerns might be. I was heavily involved with a lot of bioterrorism research back in the early 2000s following the anthrax letter attacks. And there was a flurry of funding for bioterrorism research, and after the 3, 4, or 5 year grants came to an end, that was it, and we moved on. And I think that I've heard Tony Fauci say many times, Mother Nature is the most dastardly bioterrorist of all. And so it's, it may be deemed not to be particularly interesting work to do to put research in place that would better prepare us to respond. And I would take issue, maybe this isn't exactly what you said, Jesse, but I do think that we have the tools to do incredible surveillance out in the wild, to be looking for what the potential next emerging infectious agent might be. And I think that could be money that's very well spent. But
yeah, I didn't really mean to beat on that as badly as I did. I was hoping for some technological, insight, and instead he just, the important surveillance stuff. It's very important. You can't avoid it. Absolutely.
And I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think it should be both. Absolutely. But I've served on many research review panels, and the extraordinarily meritorious proposals that don't get funded because of the current research budget, it's really disheartening. And so not only is essential research not being done, but the funding situation, I think, is also discouraging some of the best and the brightest up and coming scientists from pursuing careers in research because they don't see a future. So I certainly hope that this will be a wake-up call, and we as a society in this country will find the will to do what should have been done many years ago in terms of paying attention to the research budgets.
So, Mark, a large fraction of the biotech research funding actually exists within industry.
Yeah.
I know it may be a little bit more towards development, but there's still quite a bit of basic research and some applied but not development research. So what role do you think the private enterprise has in addressing the need to further develop, be prepared for the next pandemic or other significant, human disease?
Yeah, I mean, so we are a capitalist industry, right? Although I think we are seeing a little bit of a shift more toward a view of corporate social responsibility, broader than just the traditional responsibility to shareholders, which I think is great because most people in the industry are in the industry because they want to do good. So I think that kind of shift helps, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the industry, right? We're there to generate profits for shareholders. And I think the kind of collaboration you're describing, John, is part of that model. But to your point, the industry tends to rely on discoveries coming out of academic research centers or other publicly funded institutions as a way to accelerate innovation that they can bring to market. And sometimes it's a direct collaboration. We work with tons of academics across all elements of our value chain on a regular basis. And sometimes it's indirect, right? So back to your question to Jesse about IPO formation, it's very common to see an academic have an idea, take it to market through a startup, and then a company like Biogen either collaborates with or maybe even acquires that startup. And we're seeing a great example of that this week, right? Where Yale spawned Accellion, and then AstraZeneca stepped in and snapped them up, right? That took place over decades. But I think that's the kind of model that people pay attention to.
Yeah, when we were talking about some of the topics here, you touched on public-private partnerships, and that's what Mark is talking about, the partnership, the de facto partnership between government funding and private finance of the later stages of working on those technologies. Most people on the call don't realize this is the 40th birthday, 3 days ago, December 12th, 1980, of Bayh-Dole. And it's the Bayh-Dole Amendment to the Federal Register that permitted the outlicensing of university developments that were funded by NIH or NSF or other government agencies into the hands of ours, the private industry. And without Bayh-Dole, we would not have the biotech industry, which has now fueled all of the development of a lot of the development of the tool set that's led to the Pfizer vaccine, because that came from a startup.
Yeah. So, no, that's wonderful. You know, what I'd like to do now, I mean, there's many other questions we could discuss, but I think what I'd like to do is turn this over to some questions that we're getting from the audience. There are a number of questions that we have that came in advance, and there's a number that are coming in as we speak. And by the way, for the audience members, if you would like to ask a question, please follow the Q&A part of the WebEx, and you would be able to put a question in. And by the way, we're not going to get to everything, we know that, but at least the questions will be there, and I think that's something would be quite valuable. So here's a question that did come in through the registration. Could the novel techniques that are used today for the COVID-19 vaccine, so let's say the plug-and-play mRNA platform, also be used to produce more effective universal flu vaccine, or even a common cold, such as a common cold coronavirus?
Well, let me address that. I think the answer is, in theory, yes. With the universal influenza vaccine, there has been some progress made, irrespective of this mRNA platform, in developing an influenza vaccine. One of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of what stymies development of broad-spectrum antivirals, also can be an obstacle in universal vaccines, and that is the fact that viruses are so variable, and we know that influenza viruses change almost, from one transmission to another. But scientists have done a phenomenal job in focusing in on a highly conserved part of the hemagglutinin gene. It's basically the connection between the outside of this protein and how it is attached to the viral envelope. And so I think in the not too distant future, we may very well see a universal influenza vaccine that came about through very deliberate R&D efforts to try and make that a goal. With regard to the common cold, that would really be a breakthrough. We know that there are a limited number of coronavirus vaccines that are associated with the common cold, but there are over 150 serotypes of rhinovirus that cause the common cold. I was actually involved in a study that was published about 10 years ago now, doing the genome sequencing and analysis of over 100 rhinovirus viruses. And again, what we see is just enormous variability. They are different. They interact with cells through different cell surface receptors. That's not to say that we won't stumble upon something like what has been done with the influenza vaccine, but I think it's not for lack of looking, and it's not for lack of trying, that we don't have these kinds of universal vaccines yet, but those would be transformational.
So along the lines also about the vaccines, there's a number of concerns about the efficacy and safety of these new vaccines, particularly for seniors. And I'm wondering if there's any way to look at the data that exists now. There's been more data put out, let's say, on the Pfizer and will be on the Moderna vaccine than virtually any other vaccines to date. Is there anything we could do to assure our senior citizens that these vaccines are likely to be just as safe as the other vaccines that have been used for years?
Well, I do know that seniors, the elderly, were included as an important target demographic in the clinical trials for both of these vaccines. And there were no increased adverse events reported for that demographic. But that said, when you go from a many 100,000 clinical trial to vaccinating millions and eventually billions of people, it is inevitable that additional adverse outcomes, adverse events will be found. But I think there is very encouraging data, at least at this very early stage, to suggest that people over 60 or 65 aren't necessarily at any greater risk. And I think one of the really positive developments was that the vaccine, these vaccines seem to be as efficacious in that age group, which isn't always the case. Influenza vaccine, for example, is known to be less effective in individuals 60, 65 or older. So just have to wait and see.
So another question that's come in deals with something we touched on, of course, which is the where we have a zoonotic disease, particularly the respiratory zoonotic diseases, which jump, of course, from animals to humans. And a lot of that has to do with the way we cultivate, grow, farm, the proximity of people to large, unnatural levels of wildlife. And this has happened, obviously, in China, where you have a bat. Many of these diseases the bat serves as a reservoir of the virus. And that's an entire interesting issue alone, just why bats can do such a thing. And then either directly or more likely through some other host that ultimately is in a position to interact very closely with humans. And it's not just what happens in some country, particularly in Asian countries, but even in Europe. We had the minks in the UK and in Denmark and Holland. And of course, we know that there's linkages between, those kinds of animals like a mink to humans because of similarity in terms of the receptors on our cells and their cells. But is there an opportunity to use this pandemic as a way to say, look, economically, societally, we've got to make changes to that. And if we don't, we're just going to continue to have these more accelerated pandemics that will come into play, and we'll always be fighting from behind.
Well, that is an example of one of these unanswerable questions. It involves the ethical trade-offs involved in the distribution of wealth and money and well-being. One of the interesting things, if we think about it, that's gone on during the pandemic is the politicization, the turning into political fodder, the very serious ethical discussion of the balance between public health good and economic good, and the pain on either side. And no society that I can think of had the discussion of, well, we're going to harm X number of people's livelihood by shutting down society to prevent the healthcare system from being overrun and the loss of life of this, that, or the other segment of population. What's the right balance or trade-off? Instead, it was just a black and white, you should do it, you shouldn't do it. And this is kind of what you're touching on. Should society spend tax dollars, GDP dollars, to preemptively guard against this particular risk, or should we spend it against climate risk? I mean, the reason people aren't embracing things to mitigate CO2 emission is because it costs money and it costs jobs. And nobody, faces up to that rhetoric because there are no real answers. It's just, what do you want to do? So, excellent question. I don't know how you answer it.
We're going to be out of time now, but let me just finish with a question that actually comes from one of our undergraduates, the class of 2023. And I think this ultimately may be the most important question. So as the technology changes along with the onslaught of the pandemic, what skills should we focus on or improve upon? I think maybe each of you might be able to provide an answer that's a little bit different. Putting yourself back into your undergraduate days at Rensselaer.
Yeah, so I'll go first because I've had two different careers. I started off as a corporate strategy consultant and ended up as a biotech CIO. And I think the common capability that was sort of developed at RPI is an analytical approach to problem solving. I think in the end, everything we're talking about here is a problem, and I think RPI does a really great job of equipping its graduates to deal with problems as they emerge and as they evolve. For the fourth, I have 3 other RPI alumni on my team at Biogen, and they're all top performers and all really valuable contributors to our organization. So that's my view.
Claire, Jesse?
Yeah, well, I think I completely agree with what Mark said. I think that the ability to approach these challenges with critical thinking is essential. And I, too, owe a great debt of gratitude to Rensselaer for equipping me to go out into the world and approach problems that way. I think another, more of a cultural issue, and it's not just in the United States, we certainly see it around the world, is the fact that for all sorts of reasons, the public who, not the science interested public, but the general public has lost faith and trust in scientists. And I think we need to pay a bit more attention to how we communicate and how we interact with the people who are affected by the work that we do. And I think we are seeing this play out now. I don't know what the current numbers are, but there is a significant number of people that are very skeptical about these coronavirus vaccines, and that will ultimately have an impact. And this is another huge problem to solve. I think for a long time we as scientists believe that, well, if we just did a better job of explaining what we do and why it matters, then people will understand and will get on board. But I think we need to do more than that. It's not just what we say. We need to get out and meet these people where they live. We need to interact with them. We need to show them how science-based decisions can really be of importance to them and their families and their livelihoods. So we need to do more. And I think that the best science will only get us so far. We need more general buy-in. And we've got a lot of work to do in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those were two very powerful answers, and I'm hard pressed to add to it really, other than just tie it up in a bow and a ribbon and say that if you're a young person in school now, drill deep, get some real subject knowledge, and then add to that the analytical thinking that RPI instills very, very well. And then pick important problems to work on. Maybe the study of how disinformation spreads and what one can do about it. And that's the end of my bow and ribbon.
No, that's all of those are very poignant answers to a very important question for all of us. So we are out of time. First, I'd like to thank each of our distinguished alumni and alumnae panelists for this significant conversation that is obviously on top of, right at the top of our minds today. I would also very much like to thank all of our attendees that have joined us today, and many of the questions that have come in. Obviously, there are way too many to provide any justice to. So we'll just have to leave it at that. But for now, I'll turn it back to our presenter who will close.
Thank you to Dr. Dortick, our panelists, and attendees for joining us today. You will be receiving an email within the next few days with a link to today's recording, along with a brief survey asking for feedback to help us in planning for future virtual events. We are particularly interested in hearing what topics would be of interest to you, preferred timeframes, and other details that will be helpful as we plan future virtual events. Thank you in advance for your input, and be sure to check your email moving forward for upcoming virtual events. Please also follow the Rensselaer Institute Advancement YouTube channel for all previous virtual event recordings, as well as next Rensselaer Global Game Changers online panel discussions. You can find the channel by searching for Rensselaer Institute Advancement on YouTube. Save the date for the next Rensselaer Global Game Changers online series, February 9th, 2021, presented by the Rensselaer Silicon Valley Executive Council, and March 25th, 2021, presented by the Rensselaer New England Executive Council. Watch your email for details. Finally, now more than ever, support is needed to continue the exceptional tradition of a Rensselaer education for our incoming and current students. Please visit our website to learn how you can support Rensselaer as you consider your year-end giving options. Thank you, stay safe and healthy, have a great afternoon, and a happy holiday season.